Hi. All right, let's fill in this chart, shall we? So I know two classes got to fill in who usually votes for these people, but not everybody did. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. These are stereotypes. They are data driven. They are stereotypes. It is possible to not fit neatly into these categories. But really quickly, and if I go too fast, just pause. Republicans tend to be older. Democrats tend to be younger. Republicans tend to be male. Democrats tend to be female, but there are more female Democrats than there are consistent male Republicans. That's the gender gap, right? You could also assign non-binary folks to Democrats as well. For minorities, Republicans do not typically tend to get a large minority vote, but Democrats do. In terms of where they are popular in the United States geographically, Republicans tend to be more solid in the South, whereas Democrats to be more solid in the North. It's a pretty big difference from the Civil War time. Republicans are more likely to be found in rural areas, whereas Democrats are more likely to be found in urban or city areas. And here's the part where some of you might be offended. Hopefully not. Republicans do tend to have more money, higher paying jobs. Democrats do tend to be less financially stable or less wealthy than Republicans do. And education level, Republicans tend to have higher education, Democrats tend to have a lower education. However, please do not forget about the two-party realignments that I told you that have happened in the last few years. In 2016, the white poor population shifted from typically voting Democrat to voting Republican, and they did so for President Trump. And in 2020, the white college educated population shifted from Republican voters to Democratic voters. And in that instance, they did so for President Biden, but also against President Trump. Sometimes people vote for a candidate not because they like them, but because they are anti the other candidate. And I think that's what happened in 2020. All right, so other things you might associate with these parties: Republicans are conservative, Democrats are liberal. Republicans are right-wing, Democrats are left-wing. Just think R Republican, R right. And Democrats just think L left, L liberal. And Republicans will usually be designated in an electoral map with a red color, and Democrats with a blue color. Republicans are usually represented by the elephant. Democrats are usually represented by the donkey. Ask me about that in class, it's a fun story. And you might also hear the Republican Party referred to as the GOP, which is the Grand Ole Party. Ole as in OLE. Okay. All right, let's get into some of these issues. For business, liberals are in favor of increasing regulation on businesses and increasing worker protection. Okay. So a lot of folks who are members of unions will likely support the liberal candidate. Conservatives would like to see more ease of regulation and keep government out of business. A lot more conservatives have their own business or are successful in business because of, the fact that more Republicans are wealthier, which I think ties directly into our next category of taxation. Liberals would like to increase taxation, especially for the wealthy, Might want to throw that in there. Whereas conservatives would like to cut taxation, especially for businesses. They want to lessen corporate taxation, which does, hopefully you guys understand, equal less taxes for the wealthy, right? Abortion shouldn't surprise you. Liberals are pro-choice, conservatives are pro-life. Notice that I'm using the term pro. You're not really going to find a lot of liberals that say, yes, abortion. That just sounds bad, right? And you're not going to find a lot of conservatives who say, I don't support the right to choose. They're going to say, I support life. Language is very important. For social spending, liberals want to increase it. Just think of welfare, okay? Whereas conservatives want to decrease it or just maintain it where it is. It doesn't need to be heightened. So that's why there's been a lot of pushback from Republican office holders on coronavirus relief. Okay. Are we on the back? Okay. Go to the back. I have a few people in here. It's very helpful. Right. So I know that this is weird. Crime. Oh, did we skip some? Defense spending. Sorry, thank you. Defense spending, the Liberals would like to decrease or maintain it. Less money spent on the military and defense, whereas conservatives would like to increase it. And usually they want to take that money for the increase from social welfare programs, which is in part why Democrats or liberals fight it so hard. And I noticed the death penalty is also not on this slide, but you know, lucky you, I am here. Liberals would like to ban it. Conservatives would like to maintain it. Crime, this is interesting. You could also kind of extend this to crime and rehabilitation of prisoners, right? So crime, the liberals are going to focus on protecting the rights of the accused, of making sure that due process is being followed, right to a fair trial, a public trial, trial by jury, jury of your peers, those sorts of things. Whereas conservatives, their focus is more on strong punishment for the offenders. So whereas liberals might be focused a little bit more on possible rehabilitation of criminals, conservatives are going to say, no, let's have a stronger punishment for those who offend, which makes sense when you also think about the stances on death penalty, right? And if we want to throw in voter disenfranchisement for felons, liberals are for restoring the franchise to felons, whereas conservatives are against it. But we'll talk more about that next unit. All right, so LGBTQIA plus rights, liberals are supportive of those things, such as extending the Equal Protection Clause against hiring and firing, such as, you know, supportive of gay marriage, adoption for members who fit in that community. Conservatives would probably not be as in favor of those things. Also think of, you know, bathroom use, job applications, not having to check certain genders or not having to go into a certain gender bathroom. Liberals might be more supportive of those things, whereas conservatives might be against them. Affirmative action. So liberals are gonna be for this, right? Trying to right the wrongs of historical past by having not as stringent criteria for certain groups in job hiring and in college admittance. Whereas conservatives might be against it. They don't think that race-based preferences are constitutional. And you know, there's several Supreme Court cases about this that usually find that the concept is okay, but the method is not. Quotas are not okay. Point systems, not okay. That sort of thing. Anwar drilling, this is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, if you're curious about it. So like drilling for oil in Alaska and in other places where there's a lot of wildlife. Liberals want to prevent that. They're going to err on the side of environment in that case. Whereas conservatives will say we want to lessen our dependence on foreign oil. So they're going to pursue that as well as other domestic sources. Again. School vouchers, this is kind of interesting. In like school choice programs and in helping people find charter schools or maybe afford private school, whereas they couldn't before instead of going to public schools. Liberals want to end that. They view it as taking money out of public education. And since they tend to be as a whole less wealthy than the conservative side, they want money to be vested in public education, right? That's what they can, you know, afford. Whereas conservatives want to expand it, right? Because in all likelihood, a fair amount of them are taking advantage of private schooling. Physician-assisted suicide. So if you face a deadly disease, being able to elect to get life-ending medication and not violating the law, and having doctors be able to do that for you. Liberals want to allow it. Conservatives want to prevent it. Liberals think it's an individual's choice to determine when they want to die, if they are in those circumstances. Whereas conservatives would say that violates the Hippocratic Oath of the doctor. A doctor is there to heal, not to kill. Minimum wage, liberals want to increase it. Again, going back to the wealth component of this ideological makeup, whereas conservatives want to lower or eliminate it, which is why you're seeing a big push in the Biden administration to increase it, right? Social Security, liberals want to increase the age of eligibility because they realize that there's a lot of people trying to get it and they want to ensure it stays there. Whereas conservatives don't think it should be a government-run program. They think you should be in charge of your own retirement funds. So they want to privatize Social Security. You know, what you're paying into, that is not going to go to you, right? It's being spent right now. Healthcare, liberals want to make it 100% government controlled. The Affordable Care Act, think of that. Whereas conservatives want it to be free market. You know, think of free enterprise, think of laissez-faire. They think that people should be able to choose what they want for their healthcare. What they can afford is what they can get. You know, it's expensive, right? It's so expensive. I just had to do open enrollment. Oh, it's horrifying. Every month. So much money. Okay. Religion in schools. So liberals like separation of church and state. They want to prevent faith-based initiatives. They don't think religion has a place in legislation or in schools. Whereas conservatives are okay with there being more religion in school and faith-based initiatives. They think it helps with a better sense of morality. Think of the things I'm talking about, abstinence education instead of safe sex education, right? As one example. Gun control. Liberals think there should be more regulation of firearms, right? Pro-gun control, whereas conservatives think there should be less regulation of firearms, anti-gun control, pro-Second Amendment. Immigration. It's taken a while. Liberals want to support a path for citizenship for undocumented individuals. They also want to support access to driver's licenses, allowing people who are not citizens and people who are here illegally to get a form of government ID. Conservatives are not down with that. They do not support a path to citizenship. They believe if you want to come here, you should come here legally. And they don't think there should be government issued identification for undocumented persons. Driver's licenses are for people who are here legally. And that's what is used by most states when you are voting as a form of identification. True, in a lot of states, there's other things that you can use. And this is something that really came up in 2019 quite a bit, in 2020 around the time of the census, is reforming the census. Liberals wanted to count everybody, which is how it has been done, just FYI. So they're kind of anti-census reform. Conservatives want to count only citizens towards representation. So really this is targeting illegal immigrants, right? Who are more likely to trend in a liberal manner. And so if there's more people living in that area, chances are maybe that area could become 2 districts and there could be 2 liberals elected to office, is the idea that conservatives are trying to fight. We good? We good? I'm going to assume out there you're saying yes, Ms. Etter. Okay, just pause this if you would like. Look at these charts. I feel like we've done a lot of charts today. And this just shows you some racial and ethnic attitudes towards 3 specific issues. You can see if these fit with what I've told you, if they align. And these just show you some coalitions that are formed to elect these parties. And you can think on that question if you would like.
Okay, wise grasshoppers, let's look at ideology and economic.
I'm going to turn off my video.
12.2 in your note-taking guide, starting with number 11. So I do want you to understand that all societies wrestle with the question of what's the right role of the government in regulating government economic activity. How should individuals and businesses be left alone to pursue their economic interests? Should the government regulate working conditions, consumer safety, and the environment? Here's the first answer to that question. Adam Smith proposed a free market economy. This economy is laissez-faire in style. And laissez-faire comes from a French phrase meaning let us do it, or kind of hands off, leave us alone, in suggesting the government should stay out of the economy. This policy has the government intrude as little as possible in the economic transactions between citizens and business. And please don't forget that free enterprise, along with equality of opportunity, individualism, rule of law, and limited government, is a core part of American political culture. And even in the 19th century, in that Gilded Age, where we saw a lot of companies rise up, becoming monopolies, remember the robber barons and the captains of industry, even then, it's not as simple as keeping the government out. The federal government still would occasionally act in the economy to support broad policy goals, like building the Transcontinental Railroad. At the other end of this spectrum of thought, you have the command and control economy. Really, a lot of people like to think of dictatorships, communism here. That's okay. This is where the government dictates much of the nation's economic activity, including how much is produced, including prices for goods. Maybe we see this kind of when our nation was at war, in a wartime economy. You could also cite China before they made a switch in the 1980s, as well as the Soviet Union before communism ended there. But then you could also have a mixed economy, and that's what the United States of America has. This policy says that most economic, that should be decisions, not conditions, are left to individuals and businesses. And the government does regulate some economic activity. And I feel like we've already talked about this a little bit in terms of sometimes, the government will be involved with subsidies for farmers, or sometimes the government will, suggest a minimum wage, or put into legislation fair labor standards. But the progressive era is really where we saw the adoption of this mixed economy, where businesses are making some decisions as are consumers. Now, we do have to monitor the health of our economy, because how healthy your economy is totally guides what the economic policy is coming out of the government. So we really determine the health of the economy by looking at gross domestic product, or GDP, by looking at the unemployment rate, inflation, and then we look at inflation by examining the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. So gross domestic product is the total value of goods and services that's produced by an economy annually. And just to give you guys some gauge for measurement, in 2019, our GDP measured in at $21.43 trillion. 10 years before that, it was $14.5 trillion. And in 2000, it was about $10 trillion. Now, of course, recessions can take place. And a recession is where there are 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And hopefully you guys remember that there was a pretty bad economic recession during Obama's presidency from about 2007 to 2009. Like I mentioned earlier, another gauge for looking at the health of the economy is to examine the unemployment rate. Now, unemployment rate does not refer to people who don't have jobs. The unemployment rate refers to the percent of people who are active looking for work that cannot find work. There are people who collect disability from the government who are unable to work, but they would not necessarily factor into the unemployment here unless they're actively seeking employment. And boy, has this changed this year. We started out in 2020 in January with a 3.5% unemployment rate, which is awesome. I mean, awesome, awesome, awesome. By May, because of the pandemic, it reached 13%, which was bad, but thankfully that was short-lived. As of November the 6th, it's about 6.9%. And if you're curious where it was during the Great Depression, it was about 25%. And during the recession that I mentioned earlier, its highest was 10%. We also want to look at inflation, which is the rise in prices of goods and services. A high rate of inflation, especially if it's not accompanied by an equal increase in wages, is going to make American workers poorer. So one way that we measure inflation is by utilizing the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And what this is it looks at the cost of goods and services over time, used to measure what the cost of living is. So for my, people who are interested in the bureaucracy, this is done by the Bureau of Labor out of the Department of Labor. And every month they track the prices on about 80,000 things. 80,000 things, guys, a lot. Things like cereal, gasoline, college tuition, milk, funeral expenses, and they compare them from month to month to see what's taken place with inflation. And just so you know, in 2000, for the last 12 months, there's been about a 1.2% increase in the price of goods. And the Federal Reserve rate likes to keep that lower than 2%. So that's really not bad. Now we're going to focus on some theories of economic policy making. It shouldn't surprise you that those who are making policy have different ideas about how to define economic problems and what we should do to solve them. And even if they agree that the same economic problem exists, they're often going to differ on explaining why it happened and what we should do to solve it. So the first one we're going to look at of the three is Keynesianism. Y'all, I have been practicing saying that for the last 10 minutes. I'm going to say it one more time just because I'm excited. Keynesianism.
Keynesianism.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about Keynesianism. 3 for 3. All right. So this is based off of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who published his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money during just the depths of the Great Depression in 1936. He really believed, in your note-taking guide, that it was individual decisions in regards to saving and spending that drives business cycles. During periods of expansion or periods of boom, if you will, Keynes would write that people are going to spend more money, making excessive, unwise investing decisions, and really exacerbating an economic boom, right? Buying things that you don't need to buy. And then in an opposite situation, in a period of bust, individuals might be more gloomy, cut back on their spending and investing, which makes that situation worse, even coming to the point of a national economic depression. So he believed the main job of the government was to have policy injecting more money into the economy. And I hope it makes sense to you guys that Democrats would support this. Think of everything that FDR did with the New Deal, creating all those public works programs. President Obama tried to do something similar during the recession, creating 2.5 million jobs with the Recovery Act. So that's their hope, is that the government should put more money into the economy to stabilize it. And of course, Republicans don't like this because guess where that money would be coming from? If you said taxes, you're right. Which brings us to theory number 2, which is known as the supply side theory. You're going to see this have a bunch of different names: Reaganomics, trickle down economics. Heck, even one presidential candidate called it voodoo economics. But this theory really differs from the Keynesian economic theory. This theory emphasizes the role of supply in fostering economic growth, okay? So what this theory wants to do is to propose lower taxes on individuals and businesses. Proponents of this theory use this as the most effective tool to combat economic downturns. Critics, and this was put into place by Reagan, which is why he's there, pointing to this very fancy image. Critics call it trickle-down economics, saying that really only the wealthy are going to benefit. Because if you're giving the wealthy, the business owners, the individuals, tax breaks, those tax breaks are unlikely to make their way down to individuals in lower levels of, kind of like the socioeconomic status structure that are not directly impacted by the lower tax rates. Reagan suggested that by giving the wealthy these tax breaks, and then they'll spend more money, buy more cars, eat out at more restaurants, all American businesses would do well, going all the way down to the factory worker. Critics just say that didn't happen. Supporters, though, say that there's so much taxation that it drags down the economy and the growth of business, not really letting it flourish. And so Republicans like this. Now, both of these, the Democrats putting more money into the economy, Republicans trying to cut down on taxes. These are both examples of fiscal policy. I'm on number 3, fiscal policy, which is the government's use of taxes and spending. So the government's use of taxing and spending in an attempt to lower unemployment, support economic growth, and stabilize the economy. And something I would note if I were you is that fiscal policy is mostly shaped by Congress and the president. Of course, this fiscal policy is going to be different depending on who's in control. If Republicans are in control, you're going to see tax cuts, but you're also going to see an increase in spending on military, for example. If the Democrats are in power, you might see tax increases on those wealthier classes with an increase in government spending on social programs.
Press pause and take a picture of this slide.
Oh, which is essentially what I just talked about. Okay, so just FYI, you don't need to write this down. What the Democrats support: budgets increasing spending on programs meant to target inequity, like Obama's fiscal policy, increasing taxes on wealthy and the government spending to boost the economy. Whereas Republicans support budgets increasing military spending and decreasing taxes, like the Bush tax cuts, reducing income tax rates for wealthy Americans, and increased spending to fund wars in Iran and Afghanistan. So what's the best way to handle economic cycles? That's up to you. If you support monetary theory, you think the government should match the growth of the money supply to the growth in economic productivity. If you support Keynesianism, you think the government should stimulate the economy during times of recession by spending money to encourage growth. And that's certainly what we have seen during the pandemic, correct? But if it's supply side for you, you think the government should stimulate the economy by cutting taxes, encouraging businesses to grow and taxpayers to spend money. Now let's look at monetary policy. So according to monetary theory, the primary driver of business cycles is the supply of money in the economy, including the amount of credit that's available to people and businesses looking to borrow. So according to this theory, a policy that makes more money available could lead to inflation with too much money chasing too few goods. So monetarists argue against government efforts trying to fine-tune the nation's economy through Keynesian policy that stimulates it, like large public work projects, or supply side policies that encourage economic growth, like decreasing taxes. Instead, monetarists believe the government should try to match the access to money to the growth in economic productivity. Okay, so the definition of monetary policy, and you want to know the difference between the two. So if I were you and you're watching any of those videos I posted in CTLS, I would watch the third. Monetary policy is economic policy tools designed to regulate the amount of money in the economy. Because too much money can lead to inflation. And one way the government attempts to influence the economy is through the Federal Reserve System, often called the Fed. And the Fed is made up of a board of governors, Federal Reserve banks, member banks that are all responsible for monetary policy. And the Federal Reserve Board members are appointed by POTUS and confirmed by Senate. And they serve for fixed terms, 14 years. Now, it's important for them to serve for fixed terms, 14 years, and they can only be removed with cause. And the reason for this is probably a similar reason for members of the judicial branch for the federal government to serve life tenure. It's to remove them or insulate them from political pressure, to let them do what's right for the economy, not what Republicans want or what Democrats want, depending on who's in power at the time. And you can watch this on the Federal Reserve Board if you want. And this might be a little bit old. Sorry, it's from last spring. So the Fed has three main tools that they use to influence the economy. Number one, they can buy and sell treasuries. So buying a treasury bill is investing in the United States government, literally. The purchaser loans money to the government. The government pays the money back when the treasury bill is cashed, plus a set amount of interest. So that's the first way that they can do this. Number two, they can set the reserve rates that require banks to keep a certain amount of deposits that are kept in reserve. So the higher the reserve rate, the less money banks have available to loan to their customers. And then number three, the Fed can also influence interest rates that banks pay to borrow money from the federal government. As you lower the federal funds, rates stimulate the economy by encouraging businesses to borrow money because interest rates are lower. And this in turn influences other interest rates in the economy because banks and credit card companies usually adjust their rates as they charge their own customers in response to the actions of the Fed. So the goal in using these tools is to encourage healthy economic growth without causing damaging levels of inflation, where prices rise in response to the growth in the supply of money. So the Fed Reserve's policies could also be used to prevent the country from falling into an economic depression. For example, the Fed lowered interest rates in response to the economic crisis of 2008 in an attempt to avoid the kind of crushing downturn characterized by the Great Depression. So as the economy grows, the Fed uses these tools to control for inflation. And this is just a cool political cartoon. Feel free to press pause. Maybe we'll talk about it on Monday.
We will talk about it in class. Okay, so that's where you're going to stop in your notes. I'm going to cover ideology and social policy in class most likely on Thursday or Friday, because I've decided to move your FRQ to Monday. All right, which means your vocab, I'm going to ask for it to be turned into turnitin.com by midnight on Sunday, or you can hand it to me in class on Monday. And that's good. Yay, you're done. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I had people in here with me, so I know it's less than a class period, so that's good. Let me know if you have any questions. See you later.